Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, today we are looking at food for the brain. To say that mental health is a problem, to say that neurodegenerative diseases is a problem in the world is an understatement. Neurodegenerative diseases, of course, involve a whole range of issues through childhood, from ADHD to autism, and as we get older into dementia, Alzheimer's, and the statistics are rather sobering and affecting people at a ever younger age. And we are told, well, it's genetic, not much you can do about it, but don't worry, modern medicine is there to catch you when you fall. Fortunately, rather, genetics don't play quite the role you may have been told they do. In fact, you have a great deal more control, and that is an empowering message that I'm wanting to share with you today. My guest is Patrick Holford. Patrick is the founder of both the Institute for Optimal Nutrition and the Food for Brain Foundation. He's the author of 46 books translated in over 30 languages, including the Optimal Nutrition Bible, and his latest book, which we are really talking a lot about today, is Upgrade Your Brain. He's a retired visiting professor at the University of Teesside and is in the Orthomolecular Medicine Hall of Fame. I'm also honoured to be on the same editorial board for the Orthomolecular Medicine News Service that I've had the honour and pleasure of interviewing many of those board members. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Patrick Holford. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
A pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Patrick, I have, as I've mentioned, been on the board with you of the Orthomolecular Medical News Service, but have been watching your Food for the Brain initiative and am absolutely so excited about it, absolutely blown away by it, and I'm very keen to share that with my listeners. We hear a lot about mental health problems, and obviously that is centered on the brain and more specifically on the nervous system. How big a problem globally are nervous system problems?
Well, there was a big global study in the Lancet Neurology Journal just in April, and it showed that brain disorders, neurological disorders, mental health disorders, that 43% of the world's population, that's 3.4 billion people, right now have disability due to a brain or neurological disorder. And the cost in the UK, and I'm sure it's no different in Australia, of neurological and brain disorders, and we're talking here from autism to Alzheimer's, is more than all of cancer and all of heart disease and some combined. So massive problem, massive cost, very much on the increase, and a real concern.
I mean, we often hear, well, we're getting older, this is why we're seeing so many problems. But kids aren't getting older, are they? And kids are very much part of this problem. I mean, we've done programs on ADHD, autism. So it's affecting young and old, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we got a sort of, whatever it is, a fourfold increase in autism. And of course, some say it's being diagnosed more, but, it doesn't explain the increase. I mean, here in the UK, the Children's Society have reported a tripling in referrals for mental health in children just in the last year. And the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies says there is a global mental health emergency. There is a global mental health emergency. So it doesn't, funny enough, here in the UK, there have been 5 reports over the years looking at the scale of the problem and what it costs. And every single time, the billions just goes up and up and up and up and up. So yeah, we cannot pretend that there isn't a mental health meltdown. IQ, according to the Scandinavian studies, is falling about 7% a generation. We have every 3 seconds, someone is diagnosed with dementia. And I think the really important point to make is that Alzheimer's which is 2/3 of dementia, is a disease of a central part of the brain. You do not need to get it. It's not the natural consequence of the aging process, in just the way that, diabetes is a disease. You don't have to get it. And what I find, worst of all is we're sort of normalizing these breakdowns at both ends. It's like it's almost sort of cool to be neurodivergent, at one end, and dementia, it's just what happens. We had a big campaign in the UK, which was to make Britain dementia friendly. I want to make it dementia unfriendly. I want to stop this disease that really doesn't need to happen. You and I know many people. Our fantastic teacher, Dr. Abraham Hoffer, who died in his mid-90s. I mean, he was seeing patients up to the last 2 weeks of his life. He checked into hospital 2 days before his death, having said, I'm not feeling very well. And, his organs packed up, and he died at peace with no pain and no drugs, 2 weeks off work. So, I mean, the crazy thing is, it's like the statistic in the EU is that the average woman is going to spend 14 years of their life unable to climb 10 steps. And you go, shocker, I better keep my legs strong, because that's what it is. In Japan, in Okinawa, we see these 100-and-something-year-olds leaping around doing Tai Chi and exercises. So you think, I better keep my legs strong. You don't think it's a disease. You don't think that, loss of muscle function is a disease. And the brain is exactly the same. We are the architects of our brain's future health and destiny. And we now know an awful lot about what keeps your brain healthy. And that's the purpose of our charity, foodforthebrain.org, is to help people have healthy brains.
Yes, it's this normalization of things like obesity. That's normal. Neurodiversity, that's normal. We should accept that. And I find that often doctors who know very little, if anything, about nutritional and environmental issues, and when it comes to lifestyle, just kind of dismiss it and go, yeah, look, it's a great idea, but no one's going to do it. So here's a prescription, and a patient will be asked, why does this occur? And the answer is often, well, it's just genetics. What's your response to that?
Well, yeah, it's an excuse. It's a bit like, that's the reason why Hippocrates is the founder of medicine, because up until Hippocrates, they said, if you've got asthma or allergies or whatever it is, it's you've offended a god and you need to slaughter some chickens. So we sort of blame the gods, and now we blame the genes. The reality in relation to Alzheimer's is a very clear example, is that less than 1%, about 1 in 150 cases of Alzheimer's are actually caused by genes. We know what these genes are. They're called APP or AP and presenilin. So less than 1% is caused by genes. And by the way, if you're unlucky enough to have those genes in your family members will have got Alzheimer's in their 50s or 60s, not in their 80s or 90s. So there is this very big confusion. People say, oh, it's in the family. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's genetic. You probably eat the same food, have the same lifestyle habits, and so on. So hereditary does not mean genetic. So this is very much a diet and lifestyle disease. If less than 1% is in the genes, then it means theoretically, 99% of people could possibly prevent this disease. And to make that sort of number a bit more real, I have an amazing team of scientists from all over the world, from America to China. And actually, this is my book, Upgrade Your Brain. Yep. I'm not sure if it's physically in Australia yet. It takes a while to get there, but it's there on Kindle and Audible. But what was amazing was I studied with all these genius scientists, like Professor Jintai Yu at Fudan University in China. He's the absolute top. And Professor David Smith at Oxford University, and Associate Professor Tommy Wood at Washington, and Robert Lustig. He's our sugar daddy. You've probably heard of him.
I have.
And
yes.
And many others. And it's putting all the pieces together. But anyway, David Smith and Jintai Yu were part of a group who got hold of the largest database of information, which is the UK Biobank, and analyzed it. This is just pure mathematics, and said that right now, if we targeted what we know from that set of questions asked in 2006, I was one of those people, we could prevent 73% of dementia right now. But as I'm sure we will unpick, probably one of the biggest and most evidence-based and causal aspects is to do with B vitamins that raise something called homocysteine. And that's in America at the National Institute of Health. They attributed 22% of the risk of Alzheimer's to a raised blood level of homocysteine lowered by B vitamins. 22%. So you could almost add the 22% to the 73%. You start to realize, 80 to 90% of what's driving this disease is preventable in 99% of people. So genes really play such a small part.
Yes. Well, I've observed whether I've attended conferences on cognitive decline or cardiovascular disease or diabetes. There are common threads which run through them all, and perhaps how they manifest themselves has a genetic component, but the ultimate cause is really nutritional and environmental issues. I know in your site, Food for the Brain, and we'll talk about the cognitive function tests that you've been doing and have done on over almost 500,000 people. Incredible. Talk about a biobank. But you talk about 8 different components of this. I wonder if we might touch on, I know we're going to touch on 4 of them, and the others we will touch on as well. But let's talk about those 8 components and what people can be or should be focused on.
Well, yeah, and just to sort of give those a context, I'll tell you a story. You may not remember a guy called Fritjof Capra, a brilliant physicist, and he wrote a book called The Tao of Physics back in the 70s. And systems-based thinker. And I was lucky when he was writing the seminal book. He's from Berkeley, California. I was playing tennis with him. I was like 14. And he said to me, Patrick, he was always challenging, with questions. He says, what's the difference between you, an animate object, and an inanimate object, like a bicycle? And, he said, both have parts. The parts relate, like the wheel to the chain and the handlebars and so on. But the difference in an animate object is there's this life flowing through it. So when you understand that there is the structure of the brain, a simple example of that is that when you take the water out, 60% of the brain is fat. And we'll talk about omega-3, DHA, and those very important fats. So there's the structure of the brain. If you don't have the right building materials, you can't have a healthy brain. Then there's the function of it, which in a sense is fuel. And, we'll talk about sugar and its detrimental effects. And ketones, really interesting, derived from fats. And then whenever you're making energy, you have antioxidants, or you need antioxidants to put out the exhaust fumes. So already we've got B vitamins. I'm now running through the 8. We've got B vitamins, which is to do with homocysteine, B12, folate, B6, the most important. We've then got brain fats. I've mentioned omega-3, but it's also vitamin D and something called phospholipids, very rich in eggs and fish. And then we've got antioxidants. So we've mentioned that. Sugar, or we call it low carb and GL, which stands for glycemic load. And by the way, hidden in things like antioxidants is also oxidants, like smoking, and toxins. And then we have healthy gut. And gut includes the gums. It's all the way. So dental health is really, really important. And that's part of that. And then we come on to the sort of utilization, which is active mind, active body, good social life, good physical, social, intellectual activity. And then also what the brain has to do is to recover, and sleep is recovery. So sleep is vital. So the last of the 8 is called sleep and calm, which is really about stress and reducing it, and sleep, having enough of it. And that's how we've organized this information. And it's very easy because, when you do the test as you have, which actually measures your cognitive function, and I'd love to tell you about how we develop that and where that comes from. Then you do a questionnaire which works out your risk, and it's called the Dementia Risk Index. But the essence is, if you're doing everything wrong, you will score 100% on your future risk. And if you're doing everything right, you'll score 0%. And every single question is something that you can change. Now, you and I know, actually, all of these other diseases, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, arthritis, etc., largely driven by those 8 factors. So that's kind of like the side effects. You do this thing to make sure you never get dementia and to improve your mental health, and you find you're losing weight and your diabetes gets better and your blood pressure comes down and all the rest of it. So not surprisingly, we are human beings. Our body obeys fundamental laws, and we've far ignored the most fundamental thing, which is that you are literally made from what you eat. There's no way, that's how it is.
What a shock.
Shocker. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Change what you eat.
It's so interesting too that we've done lots of programs on low carb approach to health, and I've interviewed so many doctors who, up until their own diagnosis, had spent their entire professional career telling their patients that type 2 diabetes was irreversible and they would need to be on medication. And then they had an epiphany. Mm-hmm. Maybe there was an alternative, and there is. And when they followed that alternative, they reversed what previously had been irreversible. I mean, this is such a common story in healthcare today, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I'm really excited about the origin of where we went really wrong. And it actually goes back to Darwin, because Darwin was super bright. And he observed life, and he said that there are 2 drivers of evolution. And one is what he called the conditions of existence, and the other was natural selection. Now, I was in London last week watching a fox in the garden, having a very nice time. I'm now in the country where we have badgers. Now, badgers are not in London. So in other words, when the conditions of existence change, urbanization, the fox, through natural selection, they can really work in the cities. So the point is, natural selection does not happen until the conditions of existence change. And in literally every single thing that Darwin wrote, he said conditions of existence is the most important. And what happened historically is the aristocrats, the imperialists, they loved the idea of natural selection, that they were part of the bloodline, the royals, or whatever it happened to be. Hitler went, crazy for it with the Aryan race. The whites loved it because they could claim, superior over the blacks and all the rest of it. And then genes kick in, and that just reinforces this whole idea of sort of natural selection, that you've got good genes or bad genes. Ironically, we actually have less genes than a grain of rice. I mean, it's not quite how you think. And this whole idea of the conditions of existence was written out in what's called neo-Darwinism, literally written out. And what you and I do, which we call orthomolecular medicine, the right molecules, or Jeff Bland, my friend, who was also studying with Linus Pauling, he called it functional medicine. I called it optimum nutrition, just because I thought orthomolecular was a big mouthful. But it's all the same thing. It's changing the conditions of existence. And that's and I was recently told by the genius Michael Crawford, Professor Michael Crawford, who actually discovered omega-3 in the brain, 2 sort of astonishing things. I mean, he always asked the question of how did we become human? That's where you've got to start. Because we basically split from the chimps and the gorillas and the bonobos 6.5 million years ago. Their brain size has stayed exactly the same, and ours grew up to, from literally 350 grams all the way up to 1,700 grams at about 20, 30,000 years ago. And it wasn't genes, because we're like 1% difference in our genes. So it had to be the conditions of existence. And it actually had to be, we had to be the waterside ape. We became upright, wading in water. We were eating very high marine food diet, not just omega-3, but also phospholipids, B12, minerals, selenium, zinc, iodine. It had to be these conditions that would allow the brain to develop. And actually, our brain size has shrunk by 20% because of the conditions of existence. And the last part of this extraordinary story, and by the way, just to sort of put a clincher on that, it was David Attenborough who said, I have, when a human baby is born, there's this waxy waterproof vernix. that you wash off. He said, I've never seen that on a land-based mammal. Never, ever. It does not exist. And he said on television, I wonder if it exists in the marine mammals. And a marine biologist in Canada picked up on that. And sure enough, the marine mammals have exactly this vernix. And then the last part of this story, which kind of puts it together, is in 1901, if you wanted to join the army and fight in the Boer War, you had to be 5 foot. And I'm sure you've come to England and sometimes stayed in some old 18th century cottage. You think they were really small, and men were actually 5 foot, and we hadn't discovered protein. And it was the industrial age diet where they'd learnt to refine flour so you could store it, so it no longer could feed the life of an insect. And we'd learned how to refine sugar, but we hadn't discovered protein. And in the early 1900s, when protein was discovered, and go to work on an egg and the good British breakfast and so on, I mean, basically within 50 years, men have gone from 5 foot to 6 foot. That is how fast a change in the conditions of existence occurs. And right now, we have exactly the reverse happening. We have so many kids who, it may not be the same in Australia, I don't know, but who never eat fish.
No, I think that's very, very true here.
Don't supplement omega-3. And you literally cannot build a brain without the building materials. And that's where we went wrong. Conditions of existence, nutrition should be on the top of the health agenda.
Now, Patrick, it's so interesting to hear you reference brain size, and it is interesting and sobering to know that our brain size has reduced in the last few thousand years. But something did change, and you've alluded to it. And I've had also various programs on with vegans. Mm-hmm. And the question I ask vegans is this: we split off from the chimps 6 million years ago with the brain size, as you point out, of 350 or whatever cc's. And then we got to the point where we were today, or we were 10,000 years ago, 1700. How did that happen? And was a vegan diet included in that process? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, the thing that is, with the extraordinary research which was done in the 70s by Professor Michael Crawford, he wanted to see what kind of fats or fatty acids there were in animals and their organs. So he looked at many, many, many species of animal, and the liver, the lung, the heart, the brain, and so on. And as you'd probably imagine, the types of fatty acids varied enormously depending on what they ate and where they lived. So liver fatty acids are all over the place. But every single brain of every single animal, from a mouse to a hippopotamus to a lion to a tiger to a elephant to a dolphin to a human to a whale, without exception, has two fatty acids, two fats. One, and it's the most predominant, is omega-3 DHA, which is a marine fat. And the other is actually a plant fat, an omega-6 plant-derived fat, which is called arachidonic acid. And what that actually suggests is that we couldn't have developed our brain without a diet that was both rich in marine food and rich in plant food. You had to have both. And that's kind of, where it's at. And the problem with, a vegan diet, I wrote a book called Optimum Nutrition for Vegans. You can be a healthy vegan, but you've got to supplement. And people don't realize there have been 12 infant deaths now, vegan infant deaths. So B12 is, sacrosanct. It's only in animal food. It's not in vegetable food. If it's in it, sometimes there are claims that it's in spirulina or something, but it's always as a contaminant from bacteria or something. So you need to eat something living to get B12. And then of course, omega-3 DHA. There's a big problem at the moment that, you've been around for a while and things go through fads. And right now the fad is that omega-6 is bad. All omega-6 is bad and omega-3 is good. And everyone talks about the omega-3-6 ratio. But actually, you start on the omega-3 side with alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. It's generally rich in leaves, generally rich in cold climate leaves, so a winter cabbage, kale would be richer. It happens to also be rich in colder climate nuts like walnuts and chia and flax. And it is good for you in and of itself, but very, very little of that will turn into omega-3 DHA. I mean, probably 3-4%. Very, very little. So again, we have this problem. It's a bit like saying B vitamins, when actually each individual B vitamin does something. So the other sort of myth, in a sense, is I can get my omega-3 by eating chia seeds, which I love and I had for breakfast, but you will not get omega-3 DHA. So a vegan either has to supplement a vegan omega-3 DHA, and what's happening there is there are certain algae which fix DHA. And these are being grown commercially in giant vats to produce vegan DHA. So you can buy in the health food shop vegan omega-3 DHA. It's just as good. It's exactly the same thing. But you cannot eat anything vegan that will really give you DHA. And the point is that one of the tests we run, the omega-3 index, the pinprick blood test, which is the percentage of red blood cells that is EPA and DHA. EPA turns into DHA. They're the two most powerful in fish. Actually tells you how much brain you've got, the density of your brain. So, I mean, Michael Crawford, who's, by the way, just about to turn 94, and he works at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. He's the director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry. And they can predict from a blood sample from a woman recently pregnant whether that woman is going to have a child with neurodevelopmental problems. Wow. It's that serious. You cannot build a brain without omega-3.
But listen, a part of, and we're going to dive into these 4 things, but one of the things, and having listened to you and gone on and done the cognitive function test, which we will have links to in our show notes, I'd encourage everybody to do that test. You don't put a lot of emphasis on meat, and I mean, we've done a lot of programs on the difference between factory farmed meat, which I find unconscionable, and pasture-raised meat. Yeah. And I know the work of Weston A. Price, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, talked about that kind of nutrient-dense foods. And in traditional cultures, organ meats were very greatly prized. We focus a lot on muscle meats. What place do ethically raised, pasture-fed and finished meats and their internal organs have to play in this process?
Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I mean, basically, if an animal's energy goes towards size, they will have a small brain. And an example of that is a hippopotamus. It makes a ton of muscle mass just from eating grass, which is 7% protein. There's not a lot of protein, but all its energy goes towards size, and it has a brain about the size of a pea. So, that's just something to consider. Now, of course, an animal will contain to some extent what it eats, and you're quite right. The organs are very rich in phospholipids and so on. And what happens if you look at the food chain is that, a cat, for example, has outsourced this conversion from alpha-linolenic acid down to DHA. And in order to have more DHA, which takes time and it takes energy, so a cat has basically outsourced the first step to herbivores. So cats eat rabbits. Rabbits have done half the work, and that's how the cat ends up with more DHA in the eye and can see better, which gives them their hunting imperative. Now, lions cannot convert alpha-linolenic acid through to DHA. They cannot do it. It's just not possible. So that carnivore has got to eat a herbivore who's done a chunk of the work. Now, the thing is, I hear, and I know that Aussies love meat, so, it's kind of a hotspot. But I've been on lots of these debates. Last year at medical conferences, it was always debates about, plant or meat. Carnivores. I met all these carnivores. And I said, why carnivore? Why not be a pescivore or a fishivore, I mean, the point is, if you think about evolution, there was a time when the population was tiny and the coasts and the estuaries and the rivers were packed with mussels and cockles and shellfish, and the rock pools and the tides would catch little fish. I mean, it's really easy food. I mean, people don't realize like New York was the whole of, what is now the metropolitan area of New York was oyster beds. In London in the 1990s, you got free oysters in the pub in the East End. You had to pay for your beer, but you got free oysters. So this is easy. So I happen to spend time in Kenya, and so I run safaris. And, we know that it's hard. I mean, number one, you never stand up. All the animals that are good hunters crawl, and then they sprint. So they're four-legged, they crawl and they sprint, and we're two-legged, and we can't run very fast. So it's hard work to catch an animal, but it's very easy to have this thing. So I remember I was on this debate with this, used to be a surgeon in the American Army who only eats meat. That's all he does. And I said, why are there no big-brained animals, carnivorous animals? Because even a tiger and a lion and a leopard, they have small brains. I mean, they're under 400 grams or 400 cc. And he said, well, what about a whale or a dolphin? I said, that's my point. That is my point. It's only the marine mammals who actually have a big brain. And I'll tell you something that people don't realize, which is that a dolphin, which is the last mammal to fully commit to the sea, has every single bone we have in our hands and arms in its flippers. And in fetal evolution, it's got legs and arms and all that stuff. And so, and here was a freaky thing, because I was talking to a lovely man, you probably know him, Dr. Joe Hibbelin. He was in charge of the US Navy's health. He's a brilliant psychiatrist. And I said to him, how much omega-3 do you give to your depressed patients? Because it's really good for depression. And he said 4 grams, which is like 4 capsules. And I said, and how does that work? He said, really well. And they report a real sense of contentment. And the women report better sex. It seems to make their orgasms better. And I thought that was really interesting, because what was it that made the dolphin fully commit to the ocean? And it must have been something to do with the diet and the brain. And they're probably happier and having better sex. And they thought, right, I'm out of here. And then one of the freaky things, which if you think about it, is now you've got whales and dolphins who are permanently living in the sea. By the way, a dolphin appears to have a bigger brain than us, but it actually doubles up. It's kind of got 2 brains, because your brain has to recover with sleep. And if a dolphin only had 1 brain and went to sleep, it would drown. So it's got 1 brain that switches on and the other one switches off. But one of the things is, so now they're in the sea all the time. Has that balance of omega-3 DHA and the omega-6 changed now that they're fully in the ocean? And the answer is no, it hasn't changed at all in whales or dolphins. And what we start to realize is their migratory routes from cold waters to hot waters are getting into those hot waters where the algae have got the omega-6 fats that builds this, arachidonic acid, omega-6, and then back to the cold waters. So, when you realize it's a bit like, Morse code, or computers are programmed in 1s and 0s. Brains have to have omega-3 DHA and omega-6 arachidonic acid. And, when you start to put that logic together, it becomes so important that we eat the right food. So meat, you can do it. You can do it.
Yes.
You can do it, but it's harder. You won't get the density of nutrients that you're going to get in marine foods. I'm not saying never eat meat. And if you do eat the organs, that's what animals do. So a carnivorous animal is going to eat the organs first, eat the brain. Where I live in Kenya, if we catch a fish, my guys who run the house, they want the head. It's one eye each. The eyes are
Yep.
packed with
Yeah.
DHA.
Yeah.
You know,
We are so preoccupied with muscle meat, be it fish or animals. It's interesting because to your point about abundance, well, firstly, when I hear someone talk about I'm a carnivore, this is kind of a first world indulgence, which and an upper class first world indulgence, which I don't think is sustainable across a population. When I look at seafood, I read the book on cod and the history of cod, and I know that between England and North America, you could practically just reach down in the water and pick out a cod. You didn't have to go fishing.
Yeah.
They were that abundant. But that raises two issues which I do have, and I don't doubt that seafood is good for you. I don't doubt that at all. But it raises two issues with seafood that I always am aware of. One is sustainability. We have raped and pillaged the sea of 90% of its life. And the other one is toxicity, which I've always thought was just an issue of heavy metals. And I've always gone towards the smaller fish. But now with the ubiquitous presence of microplastics, how do we respond to that? Sustainability and toxicity.
When Professor Michael Crawford, was invited to Japan, and I wanted to say here, for every disease that exists, there's a country that doesn't have it. So, right? So Japan has a very low rate of dementia. Why? So anyway, when he was invited there, the government had him lecture in every major university. They broadcast the lecture on national television to the entire Japanese population. And at the end of his tour, they called him to the ministry to tell his story again. And at the end of which, the health minister said, we must agriculturalize the ocean. And what they have done is pure conditions of existence. They've taken areas between islands in Japan. They've stopped all trawling, because as you say, we've just been hunter-gatherer in the ocean, just grabbing as many fish as possible. So they've stopped all trawling. They've planted seagrasses and seaweeds. They've studied the fish, the keystone species of fish. One of them, for example, likes tubes. They've created artificial reefs that create the conditions of existence for the fish to come back, and the mussels and the crabs and the snappers. And in no time at all, I mean, literally within a couple of years, they had increased, seafood production massively, but in an intelligent way that regenerates the marine food web. Now, we've got tons of coast, and in Great Britain, we've got islands and all sorts of stuff. And, the idea of sticking salmon in a cage and then stressing it out and crowding it out and then having to give them antibiotics that's just prehistoric thinking. So the conditions of existence, you can recreate the marine food web. Now, when you start to think like this, you also realize we cannot be putting plastics and sewage and heavy metals and things into the ocean. The ocean is really important. And the truth is we have very little land upon which we can grow food. We've got a lot of ocean. And what's amazing is they're doing this now in Oman. They've completely regenerated their coast in the same way of thinking. You end up with you capture carbon, you get tons of kelp, and you can use that kelp as fertilizer on the land. It brings the minerals from the ocean onto the land, so you regenerate soil and you start growing better vegetables, and it's completely sustainable. And the thing is, I'm obviously, concerned as well about things like plastics. And I was looking recently at a report on mackerel, and it wasn't in the flesh. It's in the liver, it's in the kidneys, but it's not in the flesh. So I was pleased about that, because I would prefer to have a wild fish. So something like we say smash it: salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring, kipper. You may have different fish in Australia, I'm not sure, but basically,
they all sound very familiar.
The ones that you can't farm, is part of it. And then the mercury thing. I know you're a dentist, and my family go all the way back to barbers in a long line of dentists. and I don't have a filling. You know,
Impressive for a 60-plus-year-old.
well,
That's
actually,
impressive.
yeah, my dad, he said, I don't know what you're doing, but it's really good for your teeth, and but the thing is, you probably know this, that most of the mercury in the ocean actually comes from fissures in the ocean floor. In other words, volcanoes, oceanic volcanoes. That's where you get mercury. So there is mercury in the sea. There's no question. And the larger the fish, the more mercury. Also, the more selenium. And selenium binds to mercury and makes it less toxic. And in every study that I've seen, um, it's not such a big problem. Now, I tend to be perhaps like you. I sort of say salmon or smaller. And I noticed, because in Kenya we have yellowfin tuna, which is much smaller than the bluefin, and it has virtually no mercury in it. So an older, larger fish will accumulate mercury. But I think you have to be really eating a lot. And if you're getting good nutrition and good methylation, which is the B vitamins, B12 being key, this is how the body detoxifies. So I think, generally when you go towards whole food, and it could be marine food and so on, the system, balances it out. And I must admit, in the crazy days of COVID, one of the best comments I saw on one of my posts, someone said, shame there isn't a vaccine against stupidity. And
Yes.
I replied, the queue would be too long. And it's just so stupid to be doing what we're doing with plastic and do what we're doing with the ocean, because I think that the problems that we have can be solved, but they're actually solved by intelligence.
Yes.
And that is why, I don't know, there was a Netflix thing called Seaspiracy, where the idea was we all totally shun any seafood to put pressure on these terrible major trawling companies that are just ripping all the, but our IQ will go down and down. So there
Yeah.
are ways to solve the sustainability and the pollution and all that, and we just need to encourage in that direction and be a bit smarter, really.
Well, I heard you talk about this Japanese model and was so excited to hear that. It's almost like the regenerative agricultural
Yeah, same
form
thing.
of seafood, of aquaculture,
Yeah.
which is great. And I'm also really pleased to hear you say that most of the mercury is in the liver and the kidneys. That is also encouraging. The other thing, well, you've kind of touched on the brain fats as being important. I also thought that was interesting. Omega-3 improves depression and anxiety, but also orgasms in women.
It's good, isn't it? Less
It's very
aggression
good.
and better orgasms.
Yes, and its effect, and I heard you talk about the effect of that and choline, which a lot of people don't hear about, on kids and pregnant women. Could you just share that with us?
Yeah. So just to explain that the membrane of your brain cells is made of a zigzaggy thing, which is DHA omega-3. And there's a little bit of cholesterol in there that keeps the thing in place. And that is, by the way, if you drive your cholesterol too low, it increases risk of dementia. So cholesterol is a nutrient for the brain.
Yes.
It's a nutrient for the brain.
We've done quite a few programs on that, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah. So that zigzaggy DHA attaches to a thing called phospholipid. And one of the most important is called phosphatidyl choline. And it's very rich in eggs, and it's rich in organ meats, and it's rich in seafood. A tiny bit in broccoli and almonds if you're vegan. And it really should be classified as an essential nutrient, because if you feed pregnant women supplements of choline, you can measure from the age of 4 months faster speed of processing information, better memory. So really, in a sense, you need the omega-3. You can think of that like the timber. And you need the phospholipids like the choline. You think of that like the nails. But those two are put together by a process which is called methylation, which is dependent on B vitamins. So that's the hammer. The B vitamins is the hammer that attaches the nail, which is the phospholipids, to the DHA. And if you lack any one of those pieces, you cannot have a healthy brain.
Another one that we've done a program, and we had William Grant on talking about vitamin D. But just, in its wisdom, the Australian government has decided to save money by stopping testing of vitamin D in blood tests. People have to pay for it themselves.
Yeah.
Just quickly, give us what the vitamin D story and what people should be looking at and how they can achieve.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the vitamin D story is if you have a low level of vitamin D, then you have 19 times more risk of cognitive decline. If you have a high level, you've got 5 times less risk of Alzheimer's. And if you supplement vitamin D, you cut your risk by a third. That's what studies show. So it's something that is well worth spending $50 on or whatever it is to know your level. I'm not sure in Australia if it's the US or the American figures.
It's the millimole. I think it's the 50
nanomole
to 100 nanomole.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nanomole.
So I think we can say certainly above 75, probably 100. But in that zone of vitamin D, is just that alone is going to reduce your risk. I actually have struggled with vitamin D because I don't fully know how it's working in the brain. It affects, it's very multifactorial. It affects all sorts of genetic expressions and all the rest of it. But it's not building material like the phospholipids and the omegas and the B vitamins. But it definitely, the evidence is really good. So I want that. What happens, and I mean, actually, if you read through the book, what happens is you go, oh, if I do that, I'll halve my risk. And if I do that, I'll halve my risk. And if I do that, I'll halve my risk. And you soon realize that, that you'll have no risk. But I'll tell you, the thing I really want to just sort of emphasize, because it's the B vitamin story. I really want to go there, and for
let's do that.
Yeah, for a couple of reasons, and a little bit of history here. So, Professor David Smith, who was the second in charge of the Oxford Medical School, who pretty much made their pharmacology department one of the best in the world, and his team had found what Alzheimer's was in terms of the shrinkage of a central part of the brain. It's called the medial temporal lobe, or the hippocampus. And they had developed the test that measures that. So today, if you do a cognitive function test, if you're sent to a memory clinic, so if things are going wrong, you're sent to a memory clinic, they will run a cognitive function test. And if you don't do well, it's called pre-dementia or mild cognitive impairment. And if you really don't do well, it's called dementia. They cannot diagnose Alzheimer's with a cognitive function test. You then have to have a brain scan, which looks at the central area of the brain, which is where the shrinkage begins. And that was developed by David Smith's team at Oxford, who found a high level of a toxic amino acid called homocysteine in the brain. Then this is one of the world-class top scientists devised a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind trial with people with pre-dementia, half given B12, B6, folate, half given placebo. The B12 was 500 microgram. The RDA, which stands for the ridiculous dietary arbitrary, is 2.5 microgram. So we're looking at 200 times the RDA. That's what you need if you've got raised homocysteine. And they got 53% less shrinkage of the total brain, which is amazing, in a year. And the higher the homocysteine was to start with, the greater was the rate of brain shrinkage. 9 times less shrinkage in the Alzheimer's areas of the brain. And, that was astonishing. And at that time, this was 2010, I was with Professor David Smith. And when he broke the code in the study to find out the results, I said, now what? And he said, well, I hope within 5 years it will be standard NHS policy, standard health policy. And I said, what would the policy be? He said, well, you've got to test everyone's cognitive function from the age of 50 because you can start to see changes 40 years before a diagnosis. If not good, measure the homocysteine. If above 10 or 11, give the B vitamins. They cost nothing in the scheme of things. So I didn't believe it would happen like that because I've been around for a long time and I know that, it's about drugs, really. That's the truth. And so I said, okay, I got permission with his help to digitize, to make a digital version of the cognitive function test and make it freely available to people. And as you say, we're sort of cruising, hopefully by the end of this year, towards having tested 500,000 people. And that is a validated test. It's the same that's done in the memory clinic. Now, the next piece of this story was a few years later. They thought, what about omega-3? We didn't give omega-3 in our study, but we've got the blood samples. So let's measure omega-3 in the blood samples of the people in the study and split them into the third who have the lowest omega-3 in their blood and the third who have the highest. And what they found was the B vitamins didn't work at all in those with low omega-3. But in those with high omega-3, or the top third, it still may not be optimal, but we'll call it sufficient. They didn't have 53% less shrinkage. They had 73% less shrinkage, which brought the shrinkage down to the normal shrinkage you see in people who do not develop any cognitive problem. So in other words, you can tick the box and say the brain shrinkage, which is the diagnostic criteria, gone. 30% of people also had no clinical dementia rating at all. In other words, no doctor could diagnose them anymore with any level of dementia. And to contextualize this, these drugs that they've been, trying to push and get licenses for recently with crazy headlines, the breakthrough we've been waiting for, whatever. The last one, donanemab, it actually increased the rate of brain shrinkage by 20% compared to placebo. So we're talking about reducing the rate of brain shrinkage by 73% versus increasing by 20%. And so we learned here, it's a bit like, you need the hammer and you need the wood and you need the nail. You can't, and that's a very important discovery, because then what happened, I won't run through all the studies, but studies giving omega-3 that have failed went back and looked at the homocysteine level, which is the measure of B vitamins, and they found the same thing. If a person was sufficient in B vitamins, the omegas worked. B vitamin studies, which had modest effects, they went back and looked at omega-3 level. And this has happened now in China, in Holland, in Sweden. And every study, when they've gone, now I know B vitamins don't work without omegas. Omegas don't work without B vitamins. And what that means is that we vastly underestimated the effects of these because we didn't realize they're codependent. You've got to have the hammer, the nail, and the wood, to build your brain. And that is probably 40% of the whole risk for Alzheimer's, just B vitamins and omegas. And of course, if you eat seafood, you're getting the phospholipids anyway. That's the point.
And you mentioned you were with David Smith in 2010, and your hope was that in 5 years the NHS this would be common knowledge. Here we are, almost 15 years later. Is that a standard part of the NHS?
Nothing changed.
We laugh.
Well, the thing is, I think let's sort of kind of be positive about this in a sense. So, and David Smith's a wonderful example. I mean, him and Professor Linus Pauling, who helped me start the Institute for Optimum Nutrition, 48 PhDs, 2 Nobel Prizes. These are the best scientists I know. David Smith has published hundreds of papers. We're looking at brain scans you cannot ignore. Nothing he's done has been criticized. The science is impeccable. And, now he's in his sort of late 80s, probably feeling rather despondent. Because the reason why humanitarian, bright, intelligent scientists goes down the rabbit hole they go down to is to prove something which then can be used to change policy, to make people better. And you just got to realize the system is rigged, and that hasn't happened. So my attitude, I actually did purposefully pick Alzheimer's because when you've got holes in your brain, it's not reversible. I mean, we do get some very good improvements, but it's not reversible. And it's the biggest cost, it's the biggest fear, it's the biggest killer, has been since 2022 in the UK. So, it's where the stakes of prevention are highest. So I figure let's actually go for this as an arrow, because until we think prevention, nothing really is going to happen. So why don't we just go straight to the public? Cut
Yes.
out the
This is what
middleman.
I love about the food for the
Yeah.
brain movement.
I
It's
mean, the thing,
citizen scientists, the only
yeah,
way to the future.
yeah, because basically, for those who are listening, you go to foodforthebrain.org, you do the test, which is free. And don't go, I don't want to know. Of course, you want to know, because you'll fill in the questionnaire, which will then tell you exactly what you need to do to reduce your risk. And it's not in the genes. So you want to know because you are in control. You are the architect of your brain's future. If you wish, and we hope to launch this in the next month in Australia, you can buy a kit for a couple $100. You prick your finger and it measures everything, so you can actually see where you are at biologically. The minute you do any of these tests, the information is anonymous and it pours into our database. And in November, December, we go to Japan and China. We're translating it. I mean, it's not unrealistic. It's certainly my goal that we will have tested 1 million people by the end of 2025. And then what happens is it's the biggest database. So anyone wanting to do research, what's the effect of exercise or smoking or seafood or meat or, whiskey or whatever it is, every university is going to have to, come to our database to do that research, which we've built on a platform which is shared by 7,000 universities. So, we'll publish papers and, all sorts of stuff will happen. But the point is, yes, citizen science. You are the citizen. Obviously, you'll get information that will help you, but also your information is helping everybody else. It's science for the people, funded by the people, because here's the other amazing thing. We grew tenfold last year. We're doubling every month at the moment. We have no investment. It's pure charity. It's not for profit. People chip in $50 a year or £50, whatever. That's probably about $100. I'm not quite sure what the Australian dollar is. And get all sorts of benefits. But it's funded by the people, science for the people. We've got an incredible team of researchers. All the scientists I've mentioned, all these professors, they're working for nothing. And they've joined us because they know that this problem of dementia, but it could be true with other mental health problems too, will not be solved by a drug, because it's not caused by a deficiency of a drug. It will only be solved by a systems-based approach. And my dream is that this, if a government wanted to do prevention, how do they do it? And I think it has to be personalized, individual, digital, health, behavior change, educate. It's the only way. And I hope that cancer charities and diabetes charities and heart disease charities will jump on this and go, this is really good, because if we all start doing the same thing, we will reach millions. And then you're doing what science is all about. And what I love about this approach as well is, when you do a randomized placebo-controlled trial, you pick people between the age of 60 and 70 who do or don't have diabetes or this. It's very, very limited. And then you have to put it across the population, which is the great unwashed. So those people who make no changes are almost as important as those who make changes, because we can see all the patterns. And we have brilliant scientists and behavior change experts, and it's not business. There's no point where this gets sold and someone gets money for their shares. It's completely transparent, international. And we have a lot of fun. So I encourage everyone who's watching to do the test. Foodforthebrain.org.
And focused on individual and public health. What a unique, addressing the causes of those diseases. I mean, I think we can say that these epidemic of preventable chronic diseases and all the information that we know that will overcome them. Yeah. The question, and I think a lot of doctors are a bit skeptical about this, is, well, why don't we do it? Well, I think if you overlay the word business model to healthcare in our society, then it all makes sense. But in a similar way to the way the tobacco industry, we knew tobacco was bad in 1940, 1950, but it took 50, 60 years for us to make public health changes. I think this is a similar story where you're making a change at a level that is going to make a difference. And I'm really excited about it, Patrick. I congratulate you and your team on it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a guy. I mean, I'll tell you the story because it kind of makes it real. And anyway, yes, his name is Alan, or Nodge is his nickname. And Dorothy, his wife, kept finding him in different rooms at night because he couldn't find the bathroom in his own house. He was a computer programmer. He couldn't turn his computer on or off. He was an avid gardener. He couldn't even think of tomorrow. He really had lost the sense of time. He couldn't eat and talk. And so he was diagnosed with mixed dementia, which is Alzheimer's and vascular, which have the same causes and the same prevention things. And Dorothy said, well, what can we do? And they said, nothing. And 6 months later, they're trying to enroll him in a drug trial, which is just unethical. And they found our website, went on, did the test, and found out exactly what was driving the risk, and really went for it. And his cognitive function test score was in the dementia zone, down at 13. And 6 months later, it's over 30. So he's actually improved his cognition. He went to bed earlier to get more sleep. He took the B vitamins and the omegas. He cut right back on sugar and carbs. 5 days a month, he actually goes ketogenic. And he has this stuff called C8 oil, which is a type of medium chain triglyceride. Ketones, which are you're like a hybrid car. You can run on sugar or ketones. The brain can run on glucose or ketones. And the irony is, if you've eaten too much sugar in your life, you have what we call insulin resistance, which means there's insulin drives the glucose into the brain cells. The brain cells are starved of sugar because you've eaten too much. It's an irony, but it's the way it is. And then you have brain fog. And not only do you have brain fog, but your brain tells you, I need fuel. So that means I want to eat something sweet. So the addiction to sweet food is a function of insulin resistance. So he has 2 tablespoons of what's called CA oil. It's C8. It's a subfraction of coconut oil, which the liver turns into ketones. And he's planted his whole spring garden. He's back on the computer. We have some wonderful conversations. His wife says, I've got my husband back from dementia. Now, I wish I'd met him 3 years ago, because this is very, very late in the day. And he probably will decline, but much, much more slowly. So if you go for it and you do what you can, and they're all just simple steps, it can be phenomenal. Most people experience within a month an improvement in their energy, their mental alertness, their mood, and so on. And the honest truth is, and I know this in my book, Upgrade Your Brain, kind of really puts it all together, is when you get the right nutrition for your brain starts to sing. It's lovely. You fall asleep faster at night. You wake up alert. Your mood is naturally better. There's a sense of contentment. You can roll with the punches, in life so much more easily. And, you don't have those off days. And, of course, most people have not experienced this. So get in there because you're missing out. It makes such a difference. How was it for you, Ron? I know you did the test. I mean, how was
Yes, I got a score of 66, which I was really pleased with.
Yeah.
And I've got, of the 8 spokes, if you like, of the wheel, 3 of them need some work. I was low risk for low carb, sleep and calm, active brain, active body.
Yeah. So they were yellows, were they? Were they yellows?
Yeah, yellow. I was in the small risk zone for healthy gut, antioxidants, and brain fats.
Yeah. And
so I've got a bit of work to do.
A little bit of work. And did you find that was that helpful? Did it focus your attention?
My goodness. Well, I will put my score on our outro to this episode for people to have a look at it. I won't put it up now. It's just we're almost finished, but I thought it was brilliant. I would encourage everybody to do this test. And what's lovely about it is you can click on a particular component and pursue that until you get that right, and click on another component. I love the structure of it. Yeah. It's great. Listen, you've talked about, I think it's true that lowering insulin is the common denominator improving all health measures, cancer, heart disease, obviously diabetes, cognitive function. Another aspect of the spoke of the wheel is oxidation, antioxidants. And
Yes.
you've mentioned getting rid of the exhaust fumes.
Yeah.
Just talk to us a little bit about the antioxidants.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we think fruit and veg, herbs and spices, and all those foods which are, technically do reduce your risk. Vitamin C is an incredible antioxidant. And I think people don't realize that every single animal makes it. Every single animal makes it. And with a few exceptions, primates and guinea pigs. And that's why the guinea pig is the experimental animal of choice. And bats. And somebody asked me a very good question, which is if bats, the point is that only animals that don't make vitamin C can sort of die from COVID. That's the way it is. Really interesting.
That is a very interesting statement.
And someone said, well, if bats don't make vitamin C, why don't they die from COVID? And I researched it. And the answer is interval training. They're the only flying mammal. When they fly, their heart rate goes up to 1,000 beats a minute. And their temperature can go up by 1 or 2 degrees. And they've got such a strong respiratory and cardiovascular system that they can't die of a respiratory infection, but they can carry it, which I thought was very interesting. And then what I thought was fascinating was that a study recently in Newcastle, UK, because I know there's a Newcastle, Australia. I nearly got a speeding ticket there. They found that cats got the same variant of COVID as their owners, right?
Interesting.
They didn't die because a cat will make vitamin C. And that's what my teacher, Linus Pauling, he looked at animals and he found that when they get exposed to a virus, they will produce so much vitamin C that it's equivalent of a gram an hour, 1,000 milligram an hour, which is like 20 oranges an hour sort of thing. So the golden rule, with any infection, including COVID, is 3 grams the minute you have symptoms, and then a gram an hour or 2 grams every 2 hours. And it's fantastic. And I thought this cat study, it deserved a little kitty titty, which goes like this. Excuse me, it's a little rude in places. There once was a cat who got corona from her owner. She said, "Don't stroke my pussy, she's trying to self-isolate." The pussy got in such a state, no strokes, no treats, so just ate mice, which was nice. But she didn't wear a mask or bend the knee, just took extra zinc and made more vitamin C, which just goes to show that if you're a smart cat, sanitize your tongue and lick your coat and go easy on your felicitations, especially from strangers with a cough or sore throat, and stay away from vets offering untested vaccinations.
Yes. Wow. Yes. Well, Patrick, if I had shared that story, we would have been deplatformed a year ago or 2 years ago. That's the system we live in. It's not just. Thanks for that. I'm going to play that back, so just because there's a lot to unpack in that story. The vitamin C, of course, is water-based, but it's not just vitamin C, is it? It's E and glutathione.
Well,
That's
and glutathione, because vitamin C, is water-based, and it disarms water-based oxidants, like smoking. Vitamin C. Vitamin E is fat-based, and so French fries, it would deal with that, and they recycle each other. But then inside cells is the master antioxidant, which is called glutathione. And some people supplement N-acetylcysteine or NAC, which is a precursor for glutathione. Some people say that glutathione doesn't work if you supplement it because it oxidizes so fast, it's so reactive. But actually, it's recycled by anthocyanidins, the blue-red foods. So if you had some blueberries with your glutathione, it would work much better. So the synergy again, and and then there's selenium, which we mentioned, which is very important, and zinc's important, and B vitamins, and there's a whole sort of team in there. And what I'm very, very excited about, because we literally launch it in just a few weeks, is that you can measure glutathione, and practitioners measure what we call red cell glutathione, but it's very hard to measure because glutathione is so reactive that the minute you pierce someone's skin and you damage some red blood cells, they're stressed, and they're oxidizing. They're turning the glutathione into oxidized glutathione. One's called GSH, the other is GSSG, loaded and spent. And anyway, we have worked out that a method, which is brilliant from a pinprick, that instantly fixes. So it's called the glutathione index. It's the ratio between the fully loaded and the spent glutathione. And what we found is people with cognitive problems, they have less, if you like, water in the fire truck, more steam from trying to put out all these fires. And I think it's going to be an exquisite measure because something else that people don't realize, and in fact, we've just been running a research project this week in my farm in Wales, is that our friend who's director of the Bionutrient Research Institute has measured antioxidants in carrots, and it's a 40-fold variation,
In different carrots from different shops, different puts.
And you cannot predict it on organic, zero dig, biodynamic, bought in the shop. The fascinating thing as a concept, only measure so far that the Research Institute has found predicts the nutrient density of what you're eating is a measure of the respiration of the soil. Now, if the soil is full of, we could call it microbiome, fungi, bacteria, and these things called mycorrhizae that attach to the roots of plants, it's alive. And if it's alive, it's breathing, and you can measure the breathing. And then you realize that the plant's job is really to turn sunlight into sugar to feed the microbiome, which then captures all the minerals if they're there. You need the right minerals in the soil, and then creates the vitamins and pushes them back into the plant. So it's the conditions of existence. And no one's trying to sell carrots on the basis of nutrient density. They just want to sell you the biggest, fattest carrot that grew in the shortest amount of time to make the most money. And we think we eat a carrot for beta-carotene. I met a doctor the other day who says, I don't take supplements. I have a Brazil nut every day. It gives me all the selenium I need. And I looked that up, and I found that the difference in selenium in Brazil nuts was a 35-fold difference. So how do you know?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm optimum nutrition is my life's research. So I cannot rely on food only to guarantee me the level of these nutrients. So I both supplement and I eat the best food, and I'm trying to study how to fix these nutrients into plants. But I guarantee you, I mean, if you eat a lettuce that's not organic, it hasn't touched soil. We have no idea how undernourished our apparently healthy food is. So what we're trying to do individually is create the conditions of existence, give ourselves this fantastic, rich nutrition and environment, and your body, if you like, nature, will pay you back 100-fold remarkably quickly. I have seen people, as you have, with rheumatoid arthritis, get out of their armchair, and cancer, terminal, reverse it, and so on, when you make the right conditions of existence. And it's all under your control. There are only two causes of disease. One is ignorance, and the other is addiction. So the purpose of books like this is to deal with the ignorance side, and then reality is we do have to deal with some of these addictions: cigarettes, alcohol, sugar, caffeine, etc. But there are ways. And I always think when you're dealing with an addiction, a bit like if the brain is demanding sugar, which is what you get in people with dementia, and you could have like the C8 oil, the ketone, then you stop craving the sugar. So it's a bit like if you want to lose weight, the only way to lose weight is to not be hungry. So you have to get under, the thing, and then your sugar cravings can go away. That's how it works.
Patrick, what a note to finish on, and I want to thank you not only for all the wonderful work you are doing and have done, but for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with my listeners. Thank you so much.
Thanks for spreading the word. in Australia?
Well, I would certainly encourage you to go onto the site foodforthebrain.org, and do register and do, as almost 500,000 people have done globally, the cognitive function test. And this is the digitized version of a test that you would do if you were testing for dementia. But it also includes quite a bit of other things that involve your diet and lifestyle. And it then gives you a score, your dementia index score, and assessing your relative risk. And it also gives you 8 parameters by which to work on, to actually target. And we discussed 4 of them in this podcast: the effect of sugar, low carb, and glycemic index being one of those things. Brain fats is another part that we've talked about in this podcast, the omega-3 and omega-6. The methylation and the importance of B group vitamins, and also antioxidants. And these are things like vitamin C and vitamin E and CoQ10 and selenium. But it also includes 4 other parameters, and they are parameters that we have focused on in this podcast, and I do in my book. Sleep and calm being one of those, keeping an active mind, an active body, and also the importance of a healthy gut. It's a wonderful test, and I would encourage you to become one of those hundreds of thousands of people globally and to take control, to get some kind of control and advice that is so powerful and so empowering. So I would also encourage you to join our Unstress Health community, and it is there that you will explore the daily challenges that we face, the mindset with which you face those challenges, and the recovery each and every day that we need to focus on, and also the recovery if you've been diagnosed with the disease. Our Unstress Health community, unstresshealth.com. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.